In this video, we'll continue talking about the forebrain, just the higher structures of the forebrain called the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is the most prominent part of the mammalian brain, and it consists of two hemispheres. So you'll see here a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. The cerebral cortex are the outer layers of the brain, and these two hemispheres are joined by a bundle of axons called the corpus callosum. So what color do you think this corpus callosum is if it's a bundle of axons? Think about what would surround the axon to make those two hemispheres communicate quickly. The myelin. So yes, it would be a white or yellowish substance because the myelin is a fatty substance. So again, the cerebral cortex divided into two halves, and because we have a left and a right hemisphere, we have what is called lateralization. And so this is a functional asymmetries in the brain, with the left side being more logical and the right side being more creative. And again, these two hemispheres are joined by the corpus callosum and the anterior commissure. And so these are bundles of axons that help those two hemispheres communicate differently, because if we have different functions in the left and the right hemisphere, we want our left hemisphere talking to our right hemisphere very quickly. So the cerebral cortex can be divided into four lobes. We have the frontal lobe at the front of our brain, just underneath our forehead. We have the occipital lobe in the back of our brain. If you put your hand on the back of your head, that's about where your occipital lobe would be. We have our parietal lobe on the top of our head. And we have the temporal lobe just around our temples back to our ears. And you can use this acronym, FPOT, to remember frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, the four lobes of the cerebral cortex. And we'll go into detail on some of the functions of each of these lobes now. The first lobe we'll talk about is the occipital lobe. Now, the occipital lobe is in the back of your brain. It's the most posterior part of your brain. If you put your hand on the back of your head, that's about where the occipital lobe would be, and it contains the primary visual cortex. Now, light waves come in through our eyes, hit the back of our retina, synapse on a couple of cells that then send action potentials along the optic nerve back to the visual cortex. But now, where does it have to relay before going to the visual cortex? The thalamus. So that the visual information is going to that visual cortex, and thus the occipital lobe is highly responsible for visual input. The visual cortex is also known as the striate cortex because it has a striped appearance. Now, if the visual cortex was damaged, it can cause what's called cortical blindness. And so this is when the eyes function normally, you have a normal pupil response, but the individual cannot see anything or has limited sight because the neurons in the visual cortex have been damaged. The next area of the brain that we'll talk about is the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe, if you take your hands, you put them up on the top of your head towards the back, not in the front half, but towards the back, about halfway back, that contains what's called the primary somatosensory cortex. Now, if you look here, there's this kind of crevice in the middle of the brain, and that's called the central sulcus. And so we use that as a landmark when we're doing dissections. And just behind that is a big hill, and that's called a gyrus. And so this behind that central sulcus is called the postcentral gyrus, also known as the somatosensory cortex. And that is going to process our sensation of touch. And so just again to kind of talk a little bit about, you can see all these folds and these crevices in the brain, and that gives us a lot more surface volume, so more neurons can be contained in our brain than in other species. And so the hills are called gyri and the valleys are called sulci. And so again, the central sulcus is the main landmark, and behind it we have this postcentral gyrus, otherwise known as a somatosensory cortex. And again, I had you put your hands on top of your head, and maybe that'll help you remember one of the functions of the parietal lobe is our sensation of touch. So you think your hands are very sensitive to touch, right? So all those touch receptors in our skin send signals along a sensory nerve into the spinal cord, and that travels up into the brain to that primary somatosensory cortex. If we were to stimulate a neuron in that primary somatosensory cortex, you'd feel a tingle in your skin wherever that neuron was connected to. So the parietal lobe also receives information, or I should say specifically the somatosensory cortex also receives information from muscle stretch receptors and joint receptors. There are some other functions of the parietal lobe. It is going to take incoming information from kind of all of the senses, monitoring information about eye, head, and body positions so we know where we are in relationship to the rest of the world. We also know it's important for spatial information as well as numerical information. So one thing I heard or I read one time was that Albert Einstein, who was a genius and a mathematical genius, right? That his parietal lobe was actually larger than the average person. And then later I heard that it wasn't that it was larger, that he had more neurons. So you got to take some of these things with a grain of salt. But then again, if that helps you to remember that the parietal lobe is important in numerical information or numerical processing. The next area of the brain we're going to talk about is the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is located in the lateral portion of each hemisphere, going from your temple kind of back to your ears. And it's nicely positioned to process incoming auditory information. Thus, it contains what's called the auditory cortex here. So the auditory cortex is going to receive information, sound waves that come in and hit our ears. There's hair cells in there. We're not going to talk about the details, but those hair cells then send action potentials along the auditory nerve to that auditory cortex. But of course, where does it have to relay first? The thalamus. So all of this means that the temporal lobe, specifically the auditory cortex, is important in hearing. The temporal lobe is also important in memory. So the hippocampus that we talked about a little bit ago, it lays underneath that temporal lobe. And so the medial parts of the temporal lobe, the subcortical parts of that medial temporal lobe, are important in processing memory because that is where the hippocampus would be found. Wernicke's area, which is not pictured here, is also found in the temporal lobe, right about here. And Wernicke's area is important in understanding the spoken language. So I try to use the location of Wernicke's area and what the function of the temporal lobe is to help remember that it's important in understanding language, because we have the auditory cortex, which allows us to hear, and in order to understand language, we need to be able to hear it. And that's because we'll talk about another area important in language in the frontal lobe. And so we want to distinguish Wernicke's areas in the temporal lobe, and it allows us to understand language. And it's located in the left hemisphere, and that's because in most people, language is processed in that left hemisphere. Think language left. So now we're going to talk about the frontal lobe. And you see the frontal lobe here again in the front of the brain, going all the way from this central sulcus to our forehead. In humans, it is the most prominent part of the brain. And the area that's just anterior, just in front of that central sulcus, is known as the primary motor cortex or the precentral gyrus. So again, precentral gyrus would be the kind of anatomical term, but it's also known as the motor cortex because it is important in issuing orders to the muscles via, of course, the motor neurons in the spinal cord. Other areas are going to decide and plan the movement, but the motor cortex is going to finally be the one that issues the orders, the neurons in there that issues the orders to move the muscles, of course, via those motor neurons in the spinal cord. And remember, a copy of that message is also sent to the cerebellum so that it can help coordinate the movement, make sure everything is balanced, the timing is right. The frontal lobe also contains Broca's area. So here we see Broca's area in the frontal lobe. It's again going to be in the left hemisphere of the frontal lobe. And back here we can see now Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe. Now we said that Wernicke's area was in the temporal lobe because it is important in understanding language. We need to hear in order to understand language. Well, Broca's area is important in the production of language. And I use this little tidbit of information to help remember it, is that the primary motor cortex is also in the frontal lobe, and the primary motor cortex is going to allow us to move our mouth and our tongue and our vocal cords and all of the little muscles that need to be moved in the right direction to produce the sounds that we do. It's really complicated if you think about it. And so in order to produce language, we need to make all those movements, and thus it's in the frontal lobe where that motor cortex is as well. And again, Broca's area is going to be in the left hemisphere of the frontal lobe because think language left. In most people, language is processed in the left hemisphere. The frontal lobe also has what's called the prefrontal cortex. So you can see that here. Now the prefrontal cortex is the most anterior portion of the brain. It sits up at the front of your forehead. It's also part of the brain that develops into adulthood. So there's some more synapses forming, myelination occurring, all the way up into your late teens, early 20s. Now the media likes to throw out this number 25, but that's just really an average. And so, but the idea is that all the functions of the prefrontal cortex aren't fully developed until our late teens and early 20s. So the prefrontal cortex is an integration center. It's an integration center for all sensory information, and other areas of the cortex kind of bringing everything together and making sense of it. And we think of prefrontal cortex as being responsible for higher functions. You'll see on the next slide, in humans, the prefrontal cortex is larger than in any other species. And so we kind of attribute our human-like qualities to the prefrontal cortex and the size of the prefrontal cortex. And so when I say higher functions, I'm talking about things like abstract thinking and planning. I mean, if you think about it, do you think of dogs and cats as planning things out, or being able to think abstractly, think about things that they haven't done before? No, they're very much dogs especially, right? A rewards and punishment kind of thing. Like, oh, they're happy, I just want to make my master happy, and so I do the things that I know, that I've made them happy in the past. So other higher functions would be making decisions and impulse control. And if you think about it, cats and dogs really don't have much impulse control. And again, that's our prefrontal cortex is much larger than theirs. This man, Phineas Gage, was made famous by an accident that he had. He got a railroad tie that went up through his eye, out of his brain, and he survived. And it went through his prefrontal cortex. And the story goes that he went from being a very mild-mannered man to being ill-tempered, quick to anger, did very things that were, out of character. And so that helped us attribute some of that prefrontal cortex that was damaged to these functions. We also know that the prefrontal cortex plays a role in attention, working memory, and long-term memory. We had said that the hippocampus is important in the formation of new memories and encoding information, but it seems like over time the hippocampus may not store those memories forever. That at some point they get moved to the prefrontal cortex or other areas of the cortex, or perhaps that they're established in both places at the same time. It just takes longer for that memory trace to solidify in the prefrontal cortex. So this diagram here is just showing you, again, that prefrontal cortex and how it's so much larger here, shaded in blue, in humans than it is in other species. So again, thinking about how those different functions like abstract thinking, planning, impulse control, decision making, how we don't necessarily see that in lower animal species. Thank you for listening.